A rusted bus had been sitting untouched for decades, until a homeless veteran unlocked its folding door, and his German shepherd refused to let him take another step. The folding door groaned open with a metallic scream. Dust burst into the sunlight as the old bus shuddered on its worn suspension. His German shepherd froze, ears locked forward, then pawed hard at the cracked floor beneath the driver's seat, letting out one deep bark that echoed through the empty woods. The veteran felt the floor vibrate beneath his boots and realized something inside the bus was waiting. What do you think is hidden inside? The first thing Ethan Brooks noticed every morning wasn't the cold. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settled over mountain lakes before sunrise. This silence belonged to people who walked past without looking, to empty sidewalks before the city woke, to park benches that became bedrooms after dark. He had learned to wake before everyone else. Old habits, good habits, the kind that once kept men alive. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd sat beside the bench, ears forward, watching the narrow street with quiet discipline. He didn't bark when strangers passed. He didn't beg. He simply watched, reading movements the way Ethan once studied distant rooftops before entering an unfamiliar village in eastern Afghanistan. "Anything?" Ethan asked softly. Atlas glanced back, then returned his attention to the street. That meant no. No threats, not yet. Ethan rubbed the stiffness from his shoulders and reached for the backpack beneath the bench. Everything he owned fit inside it, except the dog. 41 years old, 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart he kept wrapped in an old sock because he couldn't bear to look at it. Now he counted quarters before buying coffee. He poured a little water into Atlas's bowl first. The dog always drank before he did. A delivery truck rumbled down the alley behind the grocery store. Metal clanged. A dumpster lid slammed shut. Before his mind caught up, his body had already moved. Ethan rolled off the bench, shoulder hitting wet pavement as his hands searched instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there. His breathing shortened, eyes scanning. Roofline, dumpster, windows, possible firing angles. Atlas crossed the distance instantly. Not barking. Never barking. He pressed against Ethan's chest with steady weight until the veteran's breathing slowed. Traffic. Garbage truck. Nothing more. The city returned piece by piece. Someone across the street stared for a moment before looking away. Ethan sat up slowly and wiped rainwater from his jacket. "Happens less than it used to," he muttered. It wasn't true. Atlas nudged his hand. That was enough. By mid-morning, they reached the legal aid office. The receptionist smiled politely, though her eyes lingered on Ethan's worn boots and faded backpack. "Mr. Brooks?" A man in his 60s stepped from an off office carrying a thin folder. David Keller. His handshake was firm but careful, as though he'd met enough veterans to know not everyone welcomed sudden movement. "I'm sorry for your loss." Ethan frowned. "My loss. Your grandfather." The room became strangely quiet. Walter Brooks passed away 11 days ago. Ethan stared at him. "I thought—" He stopped. He hadn't spoken to Walter in years. Not because they had argued. Because shame had a way of growing heavier than distance. Every month Ethan meant to call. Every month became another. Mr. Keller opened the folder. "Your grandfather's estate was modest." That made Ethan smile without humor. "That sounds like him. There was no house, I figured. No savings, I figured. No investments." Ethan almost laughed. What did he leave? The attorney slid a single document across the desk. A converted repair bus. Silence. "A what?" A 1994 Bluebird school bus. Mr. Keller adjusted his glasses. It has been stored at an outdoor facility near the Bitterroot foothills in Idaho for nearly 7 years. Ethan looked at the paper. One asset. One bus. That was all. He requested specifically that ownership pass directly to you. No one else wanted it? There was no one else. Those words landed harder than Ethan expected. No one else. Walter had always joked that a man didn't need much if he owned good tools and kept his word. Apparently, in the end, that was true. Mr. Keller hesitated. The storage owner covered the fees herself after your grandfather could no longer pay. Why? I believe she felt she owed him. For what? She simply wrote. He checked another note. He fixed things people couldn't afford to fix. That sounded exactly like Walter. The old man who drove from ranch to ranch repairing tractors, barns, water pumps, and generators. Sometimes for money, often for pie, sometimes for nothing. They left the office just before sunset. Rain drifted through gray clouds. Atlas walked close beside him. So that's it, Ethan whispered. A bus. Atlas looked up. Guess we're going to Idaho. The trip took nearly 2 days. Part bus, part hitchhiking, part walking. The farther north they traveled, the thinner the traffic became. Mountains replaced buildings. Pines replaced telephone poles. By late afternoon, they reached an aging storage yard tucked beneath the Bitterroot Mountains. Rows of rusting trailers sat behind chain-link fencing. Snow still lingered in shaded corners despite the spring sun. A heavy-set woman in a denim jacket stepped from the office carrying a coffee mug. You, Ethan? Yeah. She looked at Atlas first, then at Ethan. I've been waiting. You knew my grandfather? Knew him? She smiled. He rebuilt my transmission after a flood. I couldn't pay him. He said I'd settle up someday. She reached into her pocket. A brass key rested in her weathered palm. This belongs to you. Ethan accepted it. It felt warmer than it should have. She started walking toward the far end of the lot. The bus hasn't moved since the day your grandfather parked it here. They stopped before a faded yellow school bus beneath a corrugated metal roof. Flat tires, dust-covered windows, faded blue stripe along the side. Walter's bus, exactly as Ethan remembered it. His throat tightened. The woman looked from Ethan to Atlas. Then she said quietly, Your grandfather gave me one instruction. She placed another key into Ethan's hand. He told me. She paused. If one day Atlas finds this bus, give the keys to Ethan immediately. Everything inside Ethan went still. He looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd calmly watched the rusted bus. Walter had died years before. Atlas had only been part of Ethan's life for less than 4 years. No one had ever told Walter the dog's name. The mountain wind drifted through the storage yard, carrying the smell of pine, old diesel, and rust. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the woman. I'm sorry, he finally said. What exactly did my grandfather tell you? She frowned, almost surprised by the question. He said if Atlas ever found this bus, I'd know it was time. But he couldn't have known. I figured the name meant something to you. It does. Ethan looked at the German shepherd beside him. Atlas sat quietly, tail still, watching the faded yellow bus, as though he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. The woman shrugged. Walter wasn't the kind of man who explained himself. No, Ethan whispered. He wasn't. She nodded toward the bus. You should go inside. I'll leave you two alone. She walked back toward the office without another word. The gravel crunched beneath her boots until the silence returned. Ethan stood motionless for another minute. Finally, he slipped the brass key into the folding door. The lock resisted. 7 Idaho winters had welded steel to steel. He leaned harder. With a loud metallic crack, the mechanism surrendered. The folding door groaned open. A breath of stale air escaped from the darkness. Atlas stepped inside first. Not cautiously, confidently. Like a scout entering familiar ground. Ethan followed. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight, breaking across cracked windows. Nothing had been touched. Nothing. Walter had transformed the school bus decades earlier. The rows of passenger seats were gone. In their place stood handmade cabinets built from knotty pine. A narrow bunk stretched along one wall. Across from it sat a folding workbench scarred by thousands of wrench marks. Every tool hook remained exactly where Ethan remembered. Most were empty now, but their outlines remained burned into the wood by years of use. His fingers brushed the edge of the workbench. He could almost hear Walter laughing. "You don't fix machines by forcing them. You listen first." The words echoed so clearly that Ethan almost turned around. Instead, only silence answered. Atlas wandered deeper into the bus. His nose swept slowly across the worn floor. Every few feet he paused, tested the air, then moved again. Ethan drifted toward the driver's compartment. The cracked steering wheel still wore the faded leather cover Walter had stitched by hand. One corner had come loose. He smiled despite himself. "I told you to replace this." Walter had laughed. "If it still turns, it still works." Above the windshield hung an old road map of America. Colored pushpins dotted nearly every western state. Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Oregon. Tiny handwritten dates sat beside many of them. Most simply read, generator, roof, tractor, barn. One pin rested near Salmon Chalice National Forest. Unlike the others, that one carried no description, only a small pencil mark. E. His heartbeat slowed. Walter had marked something for him. Atlas suddenly froze. His ears lifted. The muscles across his shoulders tightened. Ears up. Ethan recognized the posture immediately. During deployment, military working dogs reacted exactly that way before locating hidden explosives. Atlas lowered his head, walked directly toward the driver's seat, sniffed once, twice, then began scratching furiously beneath it. Metal rang beneath his claws. Ethan crouched. "What is it, buddy?" Atlas whined. Not frightened, insistent. Ethan reached underneath the seat. His fingers met steel instead of wood. There was a rectangular plate bolted into the floor. It didn't belong there. Walter had welded it in afterward. He remembered helping hold the flashlight when he was 10 years old. Back then, Walter had smiled. Some things don't belong in plain sight. Ethan had thought he meant spare parts. Now he wasn't so sure. He searched the cabinets. The old tool drawers still opened with familiar squeaks. Inside one lay a flathead screwdriver wrapped in an oily rag. Exactly where Walter always kept it. Atlas refused to leave the compartment. His nose remained pressed against the metal plate. Ethan removed the first screw, then another. Years of rust fought every turn. The third nearly stripped before finally breaking free. By the fourth, sweat rolled down his forehead despite the cool mountain air. The steel cover lifted with a heavy scrape. Beneath it rested a dark green military ammunition box. Perfectly sealed. No rust, no moisture. Someone had wrapped it carefully in waxed canvas before hiding it away. Walter hadn't hidden junk. He had preserved something. Ethan lifted the box onto the driver's floor. His hands hesitated over the latch. Atlas sat beside him without making a sound, almost waiting. The latch snapped open. Inside lay 5 carefully arranged items: a weathered leather journal, a First Federal Savings passbook, a folded topographic map, an old brass key attached to a leather tag, and a white envelope. Across its front, written in Walter's unmistakable block handwriting, were only 2 words. For Ethan. Before Ethan could reach for it, Atlas's head jerked sharply toward the windshield. A low growl rolled deep inside his chest. Not loud, not wild, controlled, focused. The kind of warning Ethan had learned never to ignore. He slowly turned toward the front window. Beyond the chain-link fence, past the rows of abandoned trailers, between the tall pines at the edge of the property. Something moved. A dark figure, standing perfectly still, watching the bus. The instant Ethan made eye contact, the figure disappeared behind the trees. Atlas exploded toward the bus door before Ethan could say a word. Atlas! The German shepherd bounded down the steps and stopped just beyond the gravel, nose sweeping through the cool mountain air. His ears pivoted from side to side, searching for a sound too faint for human hearing. Ethan moved automatically. Old instincts took over. He didn't chase. He observed first. His eyes scanned the tree line from left to right, searching for movement instead of focusing on one spot. Shadows between the pines. Broken branches. Fresh tire tracks. A possible escape route. Nothing. The forest had swallowed whoever had been watching them. He crouched beside Atlas. What do you have? Atlas sniffed the ground, then circled once before returning to Ethan's side. No barking, no panic, just a quiet certainty that someone had been there. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. Good work. They returned to the bus, and this time Ethan closed the folding door behind them. The military box still rested on the driver's floor, untouched. He picked up the leather journal first. The cover had darkened with age, its corners rounded from years of use. When he opened it, the familiar handwriting hit him harder than he expected. Small, neat, patient. Exactly the way Walter Brooks built everything. The first pages weren't secrets. They were repair notes. Generator rebuilt outside Missoula. Roof patched near Cody. Water pump fixed for the Jensen Ranch. Names, dates, small sketches. Walter had documented almost every job he ever completed. Ethan smiled. You really wrote everything down. Atlas lay quietly beside him, though every few moments his eyes drifted toward the windshield. Still watching. Several pages later, the journal changed. The repair notes disappeared. Instead, Walter had written a date. October 14th. Bought the land today. Ethan leaned closer. 40 acres tucked beneath the Salmon Chalice Mountains. Nobody wanted it because it's too far from town and winters are hard. That's exactly why I wanted it. Another page. Started clearing trees this weekend. The creek runs year-round. Good water. Good timber. A man could build something honest here. Ethan turned another page. The entries became more personal. Ethan shipped out today. He smiled before leaving, but I saw his hands. Young men don't fidget unless they're scared. I pray he comes home with all the pieces people can't see. Ethan closed his eyes. He had never told Walter about the nightmares, never told him about the villages, about the friends who didn't make it back to the landing zone. Walter had known anyway. Atlas nudged his elbow gently. I'm all right. He wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the dog or himself. Another page. Started framing the workshop. If Ethan comes home tired of war, he'll always have work waiting. Hands heal faster when they're building something. The next several entries described weekends spent alone in the mountains, pouring concrete, raising walls, repairing old fencing, digging drainage trenches. Walter had driven hundreds of miles every weekend while Ethan was overseas, never mentioning a word, never asking for thanks, only building. Page after page. Then Ethan reached an entry that made him stop breathing. If Atlas finds the box, his eyes narrowed. He read it again. If Atlas finds the box, then the road has opened the way it was supposed to. He looked down at the dog. Atlas blinked back at him. No. He flipped ahead. 3 more entries. Again. Trust Atlas. Another. Atlas will know before Ethan does. His heartbeat quickened. Walter couldn't have written these recently. The ink had faded years ago. He grabbed the bank book, hoping for a date. The last deposit had been made almost 8 years earlier, long before Atlas had entered Ethan's life. Walter couldn't possibly have known. The only explanation was coincidence. It had to be. Yet the certainty in Walter's words unsettled him more than any ghost story ever could. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. A vehicle engine echoed faintly through the trees. Not from the storage lot, from the narrow road leading toward it. Ethan quietly lowered the journal. A dark pickup truck rolled past the front gate without stopping. Its windows were heavily tinted. It slowed, barely. Just enough for the passenger to raise something toward the bus. A camera. 3 quick clicks. Then the truck accelerated. Dust curled behind its tires as it disappeared around the bend. The woman from the office stepped outside, shielding her eyes. You know those folks? Ethan shook his head. No. They've never been here before. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Atlas stood perfectly still. His gaze remained fixed on the empty road long after the truck had vanished. Ethan looked back at Walter's journal, then at the military box. Someone had been watching the bus. Someone knew it mattered. And somehow, Walter had expected that too. He folded the topographic map open across the workbench. A red pencil circle surrounded a single location deep inside the Salmon Chalice National Forest. Next to it, Walter had written only 6 words. Finish what I couldn't finish, son. Ethan folded the map with slow, careful hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. Atlas rested his head on Ethan's knee, watching him with calm brown eyes that seemed to ask only one question. What's next? Ethan looked toward the faded windshield. The pickup truck was gone. The figure in the woods was gone. But neither felt truly gone. Someone knew about the bus. Someone had waited for him to open it. He closed the ammunition box and secured the latch. The envelope marked for Ethan remained unopened. Not yet. Some instincts came from the battlefield. Never open the last piece of intelligence until you understand the terrain. Walter had left him clues in an order. He intended Ethan to follow them. The woman from the office returned carrying a folded county map. My name's Carol Mercer, she said. Guess I never introduced myself. Ethan. I know. She smiled gently. Walter talked about you every time he came through. She spread the map across the workbench. The place you're looking for isn't easy to reach. Her finger traced a narrow mountain road. Old logging road. Most GPS systems don't even recognize it. Snow keeps people out half the year. She glanced toward the journal. I'm guessing he finally showed you. Ethan nodded. He built something out there. Carol's expression softened. He sure did. You've seen it? Only once. A long time ago. He wouldn't let anybody help. She laughed quietly. Said an old soldier ought to finish one last mission by himself. By late afternoon, Ethan had transferred the military box, the journal, and Walter's map into his backpack. The bus itself stayed exactly where it had been. He locked the folding door. His hand lingered on the yellow paint. Walter's fingerprints were gone. But somehow, the bus still felt alive. Carol walked them to the gate. "You've got about 3 hours of daylight. If you leave now, you'll reach the valley before dark." She hesitated. "One more thing." Ethan stopped. "People around those mountains mind their own business. If someone asks why you're there, tell them Walter sent you." He studied her face. "You make it sound like people still remember him." Carol smiled. "You'll see." The road narrowed until pavement disappeared beneath gravel. Towering pines swallowed the evening light. The bitter roots slowly gave way to rougher country, where mountains stood untouched and streams carved silver ribbons through the forest. Atlas rode with his head outside the truck window Carol had loaned them for the trip. Every so often his ears twitched toward sounds Ethan couldn't hear. An elk crossing somewhere uphill, a squirrel scrambling through branches. Life filled the forest. Unlike the cities, this silence wasn't empty. It breathed. 40 miles later, the logging road ended. Walter's red circle on the map pointed toward an even smaller trail. No signs, no pavement, only 2 faded tire tracks disappearing between lodgepole pines. Ethan parked. The rest would be on foot. Atlas jumped down first. Immediately he began moving ahead, stopping every 20 yards to look back. Checking. Waiting. Exactly as military working dogs had done before every patrol. Ethan adjusted his backpack. The old habits returned without effort. Watch the ridgelines. Avoid silhouetting yourself. Check soft ground for fresh tracks. He wasn't hunting anyone. But years in Afghanistan had taught him that trouble usually announced itself long before people noticed. Only those who looked survived. The trail descended into a broad valley just as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Golden light spilled across tall grass. A narrow creek wound quietly through cottonwoods. Then Ethan saw it. Concrete. Weathered gray. Straight lines that didn't belong in nature. He walked faster. The foundation came first, solid, perfectly square. Beside it stood the skeleton of a workshop. Half-finished walls leaned beneath a rusted metal roof. Nearby, a small log cabin sagged beneath years of snow and rain. Its porch had partially collapsed. One shutter hung by a single hinge. Everything else stood exactly where Walter had left it. Ethan slowly stepped onto the cracked foundation. He ran one hand across a wooden support post. Smooth. Even. Walter's work. A breeze stirred through the valley, the scent of fresh water mixed with pine resin. For one impossible second, he could almost hear hammer blows echoing across the clearing. Walter measuring, cutting, whistling off-key, building a future no one knew existed. Atlas wandered toward the cabin. He sniffed the porch, then stopped. His ears rose. Not alarm, recognition. The front door creaked open before Ethan reached it. An elderly woman stepped outside carrying a lantern. Silver hair tied neatly behind her head. Denim shirt. Work gloves. She looked at Ethan for only a second, before tears gathered in her eyes. "You've got Walter's shoulders." Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry." She smiled. "Martha Hale. I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." She walked down the porch steps with surprising steadiness. "Walter told me if you ever found this place, it meant he'd kept his promise." Ethan swallowed hard. "You knew my grandfather? Knew him?" She laughed softly. "I argued with that stubborn old fool every Saturday for nearly 5 years." She pointed toward a weathered barn behind her cabin. "Your tools are still where he left them. He made me promise not to touch a single wrench." Ethan stared at her. He knew he wasn't coming back. Martha nodded. He knew before any of us did. She reached into her apron pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper. Its edges had yellowed with age. Walter told me, "If my memory disappears before the house is finished, tell Ethan not to waste time grieving." She looked directly into his eyes. "Tell him to finish it." Silence settled over the valley. The last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Atlas walked slowly around the cabin, then stopped near the edge of the clearing. His nose hovered inches above the dirt. He sniffed once, twice, then followed an invisible scent toward the trees. The ground there was soft from yesterday's rain. Ethan knelt beside him. Fresh boot prints. Not Walter's. Not Martha's. Someone had been standing outside the cabin. Very recently. Ethan studied the boot prints without touching them. Years of patrols had taught him that the first mistake people made was stepping into the story before reading it. He crouched lower. The impressions were sharp around the edges. Rain had softened the ground the night before, but the prints hadn't blurred. Less than 24 hours old. Maybe less. The tread was deep. Heavy boots. Adult male. Walking in. Walking out. No signs of running. Whoever came here hadn't been afraid. Atlas lowered his nose and followed the trail a few yards before stopping. He looked back at Ethan. Waiting. "Not tonight," Ethan whispered. The sun had already disappeared behind the ridge. Even during deployment, he had avoided chasing an unknown contact into unfamiliar terrain after dark unless lives depended on it. The valley belonged to the night now. He wasn't about to surrender that advantage. Martha watched quietly from the porch. "You found something. Someone visited." She looked toward the tree line. "I haven't had company in weeks." "You lock your doors?" She smiled faintly. "Honey, around here folks don't steal. They wave." Ethan didn't answer. Somebody had stood outside her cabin. Somebody had photographed the bus. Those weren't coincidences. The cabin smelled of cedar, coffee, and old books. A cast-iron stove crackled in the corner while Martha prepared stew without asking whether Ethan was hungry. She already knew. Atlas curled beside the stove, though one ear remained turned toward the front door. Always listening. Martha placed 2 bowls on the table. Walter used to sit right there. She nodded toward the chair opposite Ethan. He'd eat exactly 2 bowls, then disappear before sunrise. "Working on the workshop?" She nodded. He never complained, never asked for help. He'd just smile and say, "If I can build one good place before I leave this world, that's enough." Ethan looked through the small window toward the unfinished building. "He never told me. He wanted to surprise you." She stirred her coffee. "He said soldiers spend enough time waiting. I wanted him to come home to certainty." Silence settled between them. Outside, wind moved through the pines. The sound reminded Ethan of rotor blades. Not exactly. Just enough. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The cabin disappeared. Sand. Heat. The smell of burning rubber. Someone shouting over a radio. "Contact east!" The flash came without warning. A pressure wave. Dust exploding upward. His hands clenched. The spoon struck the floor. Metal against wood. Atlas was beside him before the sound finished echoing. The dog rested one paw lightly across Ethan's boot, grounding him, breathing with him. The room returned slowly. The stove, the lantern. Martha. She didn't ask questions, didn't say she was sorry. She simply picked up the spoon. "Walter said loud noises still bothered you." Ethan blinked. I never told him that. "No." She smiled gently. You didn't have to. Later that night, Ethan unrolled his sleeping bag inside the unfinished workshop. He wanted to stay close to Walter's work. Moonlight spilled through exposed roof beams. Atlas settled beside the doorway, facing outward, guarding. Ethan opened the journal again. Another entry. Started the roof today. Hammer echoed clear across the valley. Made me think of helicopters. Hope it doesn't bother Ethan when he comes home. Ethan stared at the words. Walter had noticed everything, even fears Ethan hadn't admitted to himself. Further down the page, another sentence caught his eye. A man can't outrun war, but he can build something louder than its memories. He closed the journal. Sleep didn't come easily. It rarely did. When it finally arrived, it wasn't peaceful. He was back in Afghanistan. Night operation, mountains, thin air. The team moved silently toward a compound. Atlas wasn't there. Instead, another military working dog trotted ahead beside its handler. The radio crackled. LZ secure. A flash. Then another. Someone screamed his name. Everything dissolved into white light. Ethan jerked awake. His heart hammered against his ribs. Darkness. Cold air. The unfinished workshop. He checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. Exactly. Every time. The same minute. The same memory. Atlas hadn't barked. Instead, the German shepherd had climbed beside him and rested his muzzle across Ethan's chest. Steady pressure. Slow breathing. The nightmare loosened its grip. You always know. Atlas blinked. Nothing more. Unable to sleep, Ethan stepped outside. Stars filled the Idaho sky. The creek whispered somewhere beyond the trees. He began walking the perimeter. Old habit. Never trust what daylight tells you. Halfway around the workshop, Atlas froze. His head snapped toward an old ponderosa pine overlooking the clearing. Ethan followed. Something reflected moonlight. Small, round, glass. He approached from the side rather than directly beneath it. Again, habit. Never silhouette yourself. 10 feet above the ground, strapped to the trunk with camouflage webbing, sat a modern trail camera. Fresh batteries. Fresh memory card. Its lens pointed directly at the workshop and the cabin. Someone hadn't just visited. Someone had been watching. For days. Maybe longer. Ethan removed the camera carefully. No fingerprints. Gloves. Professional enough. He turned it over. No owner's markings. No hunting permit tag. Nothing. Atlas sniffed the base of the tree, then looked toward the northern ridge. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of cigarette smoke. Somewhere, out there, someone was still close enough to watch. Ethan slipped the trail camera into his backpack and stood motionless beneath the towering pine. He didn't chase the scent of cigarette smoke. He let it drift away. One lesson had stayed with him long after Afghanistan. Never let someone else choose the battlefield. Atlas stayed beside him until they reached the workshop. Only then did the German shepherd relax enough to lie near the doorway, though his ears continued tracking every sound carried through the valley. Dawn arrived wrapped in silver mist. The creek whispered through smooth stones while sunlight filtered between the lodgepole pines, slowly revealing Walter's unfinished dream. The workshop looked different in daylight, not abandoned. Waiting. Ethan climbed onto the roof with a pry bar and hammer. Walter had left bundles of weathered shingles stacked beneath a tarp. Many were ruined, but enough remained to begin replacing the sections where snow had worked its way beneath the tar paper. Every swing of the hammer echoed across the valley. The sharp metallic rhythm pulled him somewhere else. Concrete walls, dust, a forward operating base, the ringing of steel followed by a blast that lifted men off their feet. His arm froze in midair. For an instant, he smelled burned fuel instead of fresh pine. Atlas barked once. Only once. Ethan looked down. The dog stood below the ladder, eyes fixed on him. His breathing slowed. The valley returned. He drove the nail home, then another. One board at a time. One breath at a time. Near noon, an aging pickup rolled into the clearing. Ethan instinctively stepped off the roof, keeping the truck in view while avoiding standing directly in front of it. The driver's door opened. An older man climbed out carrying a weathered toolbox. Broad shoulders, gray beard. Marine Corps cap faded almost white. He stopped several yards away. "You Walter's grandson?" "I am." The man nodded. "Knew I'd recognize you. You've got his eyes." He extended a rough hand. "Name's Frank Delaney. Walter rebuilt my irrigation pump 15 years ago. I came to settle a debt." Before Ethan could answer, Frank walked to the truck bed and lowered a portable generator onto the ground. "It still runs. Needs a carburetor cleaned every spring. Figured it'd sound better over here than sitting in my shed." "I'm not looking for charity," Ethan said quietly. Frank chuckled. Neither was Walter. "He fixed my place anyway." He tipped his cap toward the workshop. "Mind if an old Marine gives you a hand?" Ethan looked at the generator, then at Frank. Finally, he smiled. "I could use another set of hands." By mid-afternoon, another truck arrived, then another. Word traveled faster in mountain country than Ethan expected. A retired electrician named Carl Hansen unloaded 2 rolls of heavy-gauge wire. A rancher named Ellie Morgan backed in with reclaimed cedar beams. The owner of a small hardware store, Sam Reeves, climbed out carrying boxes of galvanized nails, screws, roofing felt, and window flashing. Nobody talked about money. Nobody mentioned payment. They walked around the workshop, studying Walter's framing with quiet respect. Frank ran his palm along one of the support posts. "He still cuts a straighter line than most folks alive." Carl laughed. "He measured everything 3 times. Sam nodded. "And still bought extra lumber." For the first time in years, Ethan found himself listening instead of guarding every conversation. These people weren't strangers. They were chapters of Walter's life. Each one carried another story. "He fixed my barn after the wildfire. He rebuilt my wife's wheelchair ramp. He spent 2 days getting my tractor running during calving season. He never charged enough." Atlas wandered calmly among them. Every newcomer paused to scratch behind his ears. The dog accepted each greeting politely before returning to Ethan's side. Late that afternoon, a shout echoed from the pasture beyond the creek. "Help!" Everyone turned. A young boy was sprinting through waist-high grass. Behind him, an angry young bull had broken through a damaged fence. The distance closed fast. The boy stumbled. Frank started running, so did Ethan. But Atlas was already moving. The German shepherd cut across the field at full speed, angling rather than chasing directly. Ethan recognized the tactic immediately. Intercept, not pursue. Atlas reached the boy first, barking sharply as he darted toward the charging animal. The bull swung its head toward the dog. Atlas sidestepped at the last instant, drawing the animal away from the child. "Get behind the fence!" Ethan shouted. The boy scrambled through an opening between 2 posts. Frank grabbed a loose gate and slammed it shut just as the bull wheeled back toward Atlas. The dog bounded over a fallen log, keeping just beyond the animal's reach until the rancher's ATV roared across the pasture. Within moments, the bull was guided back toward the broken enclosure. Silence settled over the valley again. The boy's mother hurried across the field, tears shining in her eyes. She wrapped her son in a fierce embrace before kneeling beside Atlas. I don't know how to thank you. Atlas simply wagged his tail once. Ethan crouched beside him and ran a hand along his neck. You did good. Very good. As the sun slipped behind the western ridge, the volunteers packed their tools. We'll be back tomorrow, Sam said. So will I, Frank added. One by one, they drove away. The valley grew quiet once more. Ethan stood on the unfinished porch beside Atlas. For the first time since leaving the army, he didn't feel completely alone. Then Atlas stiffened. The dog turned toward the opposite ridge. Far beyond the creek, a man stood partially hidden among the pines. Sunlight flashed briefly across the lenses of binoculars. The stranger lowered them, turned, and disappeared into the trees. Ethan kept watching the ridge long after the man was gone. Most people looked where someone had been. Training taught him to look where they were going. Atlas stood motionless beside him, his body angled toward the tree line, ears fixed forward. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine sap, damp earth, and something else. Gun oil. Faint. Old. But there. Ethan didn't mention it to the volunteers as they packed their trucks. There was no point creating fear without facts. Instead, he quietly walked each of them back to their vehicles, making mental notes of license plates, tire patterns, and departure times. By the time the last pickup disappeared down the logging road, darkness had begun settling into the valley. He closed the workshop doors, checked every window, tested every latch, not because he expected trouble, because routine kept panic from making decisions. Martha arrived shortly before sunset, carrying a pot of beef stew. You've worked enough for one day. She noticed the way Ethan kept glancing toward the woods. Still thinking about those tracks? And the man with binoculars. She set the pot on the workbench. Walter used to do that. What? Look into the trees instead of at people. She smiled gently. He said the woods always tell the truth. Ethan managed a faint smile. So did the army. After dinner, Martha returned to her cabin. The valley grew quiet. Only the creek and the wind remained. Atlas refused to come inside. He settled just outside the workshop entrance, facing the darkness. Around midnight, Ethan woke without knowing why. No nightmare. No explosion. Just silence. The kind that felt wrong. He checked his watch. 12:43. Atlas wasn't at the doorway. Ethan reached for the flashlight. Before he could switch it on, a low growl drifted through the darkness. Atlas. Short. Controlled. Warning. Ethan killed the flashlight before it came on. Light worked both ways. He listened. 30 yards away, a soft metallic scrape. Someone touching steel. He moved without sound. Years earlier, his team had practiced crossing gravel without making a single crunch. The skill returned naturally. He slipped along the outside wall of the workshop, staying within the shadow cast by the unfinished roof. Atlas appeared beside a stack of lumber. The dog didn't bark. He simply looked toward the rear wall. Ethan followed his gaze. A dark silhouette knelt beside one of Walter's tool cabinets. Gloved hands. Flashlight covered with red tape. Whoever it was knew enough not to use white light. Professional. Or experienced. Ethan stayed behind cover. Distance. 25 feet. No visible weapon. Unknown second subject. He picked up a loose length of scrap lumber and tossed it toward the opposite side of the clearing. The board crashed into a pile of roofing tin. The intruder reacted instantly, turning toward the sound, exactly as Ethan expected. Atlas took off. The German Shepherd crossed the distance in seconds. The intruder spun back just as Atlas leaped. A shout split the night. The man stumbled backward. Something flashed in his hand, a handgun. The shot cracked across the valley. Atlas yelped, not loudly, just once. Ethan lunged. The intruder shoved Atlas aside and sprinted toward the trees. By the time Ethan reached the edge of the clearing, the man had already vanished into the darkness. He didn't chase. Every instinct screamed to pursue. Every lesson he'd learned told him not to. Unknown terrain, unknown numbers, unknown objective. He turned back. Atlas! The German shepherd emerged from behind a stump, limping heavily. Blood darkened the fur along his right shoulder. The bullet had grazed him. Not deep, but enough. Ethan dropped to one knee. Easy. Easy, buddy. Atlas leaned against him, but never took his eyes off the woods. Still guarding. Still working. Inside the workshop, Ethan opened the old military medical kit he had carried home years earlier. The zipper still worked. Combat gauze, sterile saline, pressure bandage. His hands moved automatically. Clean, inspect, flush, pressure. Atlas never struggled. He simply rested his head against Ethan's arm while the wound was cleaned. You've been braver than half the men I served with. The dog's tail thumped the floor once. When the bleeding finally stopped, Ethan wrapped the shoulder carefully. It'll heal. He hoped he was telling the truth. Only after Atlas had fallen asleep did Ethan return outside. The workshop looked untouched. Nothing appeared stolen. Then he noticed the cabinet. Walter's old cabinet. Every drawer had been pulled open. Sockets scattered. Wrenches tossed aside. Rags thrown onto the floor. Not random. Someone had searched every compartment. Carefully. Systematically. Ethan walked back to the bus map and military box he had hidden beneath loose floorboards inside the workshop. Both were still there, untouched. Understanding settled over him slowly. The intruder hadn't come for tools. He hadn't come for money. He hadn't even cared about the workshop. He had been looking for one thing: the military ammunition box Walter had hidden beneath the driver's seat. Someone else knew it existed, and if they were willing to shoot a dog to find it, they weren't finished yet. Morning arrived slowly over the valley. Thin fog drifted above the creek, while sunlight spilled across the unfinished workshop. The fresh scent of pine mixed with the sharp smell of antiseptic from Atlas's bandaged shoulder. Ethan had barely slept, not because of another nightmare. This time, every creak of the old cabin had sounded like footsteps. Atlas opened his eyes as Ethan knelt beside him. Easy. The German shepherd lifted his head, tested his injured leg, then stood. A slight limp. Nothing more. Ethan smiled. I've seen Marines complain more. Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail. Outside, the valley looked peaceful enough to fool anyone who hadn't lived through war. The mountains didn't care what had happened during the night. The creek kept flowing. Birds kept singing. Only Ethan noticed the broken grass where the intruder had fled. He walked the edge of the clearing once more. The tracks were clearer in daylight. Size 11. Heavy work boots. The stride remained steady until the tree line. No blood, no dropped equipment. Professional enough to leave little behind. Except a fresh cigarette butt lay beneath a cedar tree. Filtered, imported brand. Not something local ranchers usually smoked. He slipped it into a small plastic evidence bag from his old first aid kit. Old habits. Never assume something useless. Martha arrived carrying coffee before 8. The moment she saw Atlas's bandage, the color drained from her face. Oh, sweetheart. She knelt beside the dog and gently scratched behind his ears. What happened? Someone broke in. Her eyes found Ethan. They shot at him. A grazing wound. He'll be all right. She She stood very still. I've lived here 32 years. No one has ever fired a gun in this valley unless they were hunting elk. They weren't hunting. No. She looked toward the workshop. They were hunting something else. Ethan nodded. The military box. Martha didn't seem surprised. Instead, she sighed. I was afraid this day would come. Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the distant growl of an engine echoed through the valley. Not a pickup, too smooth, too quiet. A dark SUV rolled slowly into the clearing. Its paint reflected the morning sun like polished glass. A second vehicle followed behind it, a silver sedan. Neither belonged in a place like this. Atlas stepped forward despite his injured shoulder. His ears flattened. Low growl. Warning. The SUV stopped beside the unfinished porch. The driver's door opened. A tall man in an expensive field jacket climbed out. Mid-50s. Perfect haircut. Clean boots. Boots that had never walked through mud unless someone else cleaned them afterward. He removed a pair of sunglasses and studied the workshop without acknowledging Ethan. So, he finally said, you've done more work than I expected. Ethan didn't answer. The man smiled politely. Douglas Brooks. He extended one hand. We're family. Ethan looked at the hand, then at the face. He remembered him. Not well. Only from one Thanksgiving nearly 20 years earlier. Walter's distant nephew. The one who spent dinner talking about investments while everyone else talked about family. You remember me? Douglas said. Barely, that's fair. Douglas withdrew his hand. A younger man stepped from the sedan carrying a leather briefcase. Dark suit, pressed shirt, legal pad. Attorney. I apologize for arriving without notice, Douglas continued. But I assumed you'd want this conversation sooner rather than later. Ethan folded his arms. What conversation? Douglas looked around the property. The land, the workshop, the bank account. My uncle left quite a complicated estate. My grandfather left it to me. Douglas gave a sympathetic smile. That's what you were told. He nodded toward the attorney. My counsel has copies of the probate records. The ownership isn't nearly as simple as you think. Atlas moved closer to Ethan, positioning himself between the two men. Douglas glanced at the dog. He always this protective? He knows people. I imagine he does. The attorney opened his briefcase. Mr. Brooks, he said professionally. Our records indicate Mr. Douglas Brooks served as Walter Brooks' financial representative during the final years of his life. I know what power of attorney means, Ethan replied. Good. Then you understand there may be unresolved questions regarding property transfers, financial accounts, and inheritance. Douglas slowly walked toward the workshop, running one hand across Walter's framing. He built well. He always did. Then he turned back. I honestly believed this place was nothing more than empty land. His eyes settled briefly on the fresh roof repairs. I can see I was mistaken. What do you want? Ethan asked. Douglas didn't hesitate. I want what's legally mine. Silence settled across the clearing. Only the creek continued speaking. My uncle wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Douglas's voice remained calm. If assets were transferred improperly, they'll have to be reviewed. You saying my grandfather didn't know what he was doing? I'm saying the court may ask that question. Ethan looked at him for several seconds. His pulse remained steady. Years ago, he might have answered anger with anger. Combat had taught him something different. The calmest man usually controlled the fight. So you drove all the way out here, Ethan said quietly. To tell a homeless veteran he doesn't own the only thing his grandfather left him. Douglas sighed. I drove out here to avoid unnecessary conflict. Atlas never took his eyes off him. Not once. Douglas noticed. The smile faded slightly. Fine dog. He was. Ethan rested one hand gently on Atlas's neck. He still is. Douglas looked toward the mountains. You should think carefully before spending another dollar on this place. He nodded toward the workshop. If the court rules in my favor, you'll be improving someone else's property. Without another word, he turned back toward the SUV. The attorney followed. Neither man seemed hurried. Neither seemed nervous. As the vehicles disappeared down the logging road, dust drifted slowly across the clearing. Atlas remained standing exactly where he was. Then, without warning, he turned sharply toward the rear of the property. Ignoring his sore shoulder, the German shepherd limped across the tall grass toward a rocky outcrop overlooking the creek. He stopped beside the largest boulder, sniffed once, then began digging furiously. Atlas! Ethan hurried across the clearing, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The German shepherd ignored the pain in his bandaged shoulder, clawing at the ground with determined strokes. Dirt flew behind him. Every few seconds he paused, sniffed again, then dug even harder. Martha reached them, breathing heavily. What on earth has he found? I don't know. But Ethan recognized that look. Atlas wasn't chasing a scent. He was following a destination. The same certainty he'd shown beneath the driver's seat of Walter's bus. Within moments, the dog's paw struck something solid. Thunk! He stopped and barked once. Ethan dropped to one knee and brushed away the remaining dirt with both hands. Beneath the roots of the old pine lay the corner of a rusted steel pipe, capped at both ends. It wasn't natural. It had been buried deliberately. Walter had always believed that the best hiding place wasn't inside a safe. It was somewhere no one thought to dig. Help me, Ethan said. Frank had left a shovel leaning against the workshop after yesterday's work. Ethan retrieved it and widened the hole carefully, avoiding the pipe itself. 20 minutes later, the cylinder lay on the grass, nearly 3 feet long and sealed with heavy threaded caps. Despite years underground, it remained dry. Walter had coated the threads with grease before burying it. Ethan smiled despite the tension, still thinking 10 steps ahead. He twisted the first cap loose. Inside was another layer of oilcloth, then another. Every document had been wrapped separately, protected against water, protected against time. The first packet contained a certified property deed. Ethan unfolded it carefully. Owner Ethan Michael Brooks. Recording date 9 years earlier. He looked up. 9 years. Martha took the paper. Her weathered hands trembled. This was before Walter ever signed power of attorney. Almost 2 years before, Ethan replied. She nodded slowly. Douglas can't undo something that was already transferred. The second packet contained bank documents, a custodial trust. Walter Brooks, grantor. Ethan Brooks, beneficiary. Every deposit was listed. Small amounts, $40, $75, $100. Never much. Year after year. The final balance matched the passbook Ethan had found inside the bus. Walter hadn't hidden money. He had documented ownership. The third packet contained legal correspondence, letters from the county recorder, tax receipts, survey maps. Every page carried official stamps and signatures. Walter hadn't relied on promises. He had relied on paperwork. Then Ethan found a smaller envelope. Unlike the others, this one wasn't addressed through a lawyer. Only 2 words appeared across the front. For Ethan. His thumb rested on the seal. Martha quietly shook her head. Don't. He looked at her. Walter always had a reason for the order he did things. She glanced toward the workshop. He wanted you to build first, fight second, and grieve last. Ethan studied the envelope. He slipped it back into the pipe. Not yet. Atlas nudged his arm approvingly, then lay down beside the open cylinder. The dog looked exhausted. His injured shoulder had begun bleeding through the bandage again. Ethan immediately unpacked the medical kit. You've done enough for today. He removed the old dressing. The wound remained clean, just reopened from digging. Atlas never flinched while Ethan irrigated the graze with sterile saline and wrapped it with fresh gauze. You found it anyway. The dog's eyes never left Ethan's face. Martha smiled softly. Walter always said dogs don't care about secrets. They only care about people. By afternoon, Sam Reeves arrived with another truckload of lumber. Frank followed behind him. The retired electrician, Carl Hansen, came shortly after. They found Ethan carefully organizing the recovered documents inside the workshop. Sam looked at the papers. You all right? Ethan nodded. I think my grandfather already answered Douglas. Frank adjusted his cap. Walter usually did. The men returned to work without asking another question. Hammers echoed through the valley. Circular saws hummed. Fresh-cut pine filled the air. For several hours, the workshop became exactly what Walter had imagined years before. Not a building, a gathering place. Ethan installed the final roof braces while Frank secured the ridge beam. Carl measured conduit for permanent wiring. Sam sorted windows by size. Nobody spoke much. They didn't need to. Work had its own language. Late that afternoon, Ethan climbed down from the ladder and looked across the valley. For the first time since arriving, the workshop no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Atlas rested in the shade near the porch, watching every person who entered the clearing. His eyes softened whenever Ethan came into view. The wound had slowed him, not broken him. As sunset painted the mountains gold, Ethan locked the recovered documents inside the military ammunition box. Then he hid the box beneath newly installed floorboards in the workshop. Only he knew where. Only Atlas had watched. Before turning in for the night, Ethan stood alone beside Walter's unfinished porch. The unopened letter rested in his hands. He traced the familiar handwriting with one finger. Not tonight. Tomorrow, he would drive into town. Tomorrow, Douglas's lawyer would see the dates. Tomorrow, the fight would begin. But tonight, he wanted one more evening believing his grandfather was still speaking through blueprints, timber, and quiet acts of love instead of through goodbye letters. The valley settled into silence. The last orange light faded from the western ridge, leaving only the soft murmur of the creek and the distant call of an owl. Ethan sat alone on the unfinished porch, the unopened letter resting in his jacket pocket. Atlas lay beside him. Every few minutes, the German shepherd lifted his head toward the dark timberline, then relaxed again. Still working, even asleep. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. You've earned tomorrow off. Atlas opened one eye. Neither of them believed that. The drive into Haven Creek the next morning took nearly an hour. Fog clung to the low valleys before burning away beneath the clear Idaho sky. Martha rode with Ethan. The military box rested on the floorboard between them. Neither spoke much. There wasn't anything left to rehearse. Facts didn't need rehearsing. The courthouse occupied an old brick building beside the county library. Pickup trucks lined the street. Farmers carrying paperwork nodded politely as they walked inside. Douglas Brooks was already waiting. So was his attorney. Douglas looked rested, confident, until he saw the green military box. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. You found something, he said. Ethan didn't answer. The attorney for the county probate office invited everyone into a modest conference room rather than a courtroom. "This is an informal mediation," she explained. "If ownership can be resolved today, further litigation won't be necessary." Douglas folded his hands. "My position remains unchanged. The property and financial assets should be reviewed as part of Walter Brooks's estate." The attorney turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan quietly placed the first document on the table. The certified deed. No speeches. No accusations. Only paper. The county attorney adjusted her glasses. She examined the recording stamp, then checked the recording number. She looked toward Douglas's attorney. "This transfer was recorded 9 years ago." Douglas frowned. His attorney reached for the document. Silence filled the room. Next came the custodial trust. Then the bank records. Every deposit. Every signature. Every date. The attorney flipped carefully through each page before stopping at the final notarized certification. She looked directly at Douglas. "These assets were legally transferred years before you obtained financial power of attorney." Douglas leaned forward. "There has to be some mistake." "There isn't." His own attorney slowly removed his glasses. "The deed predates your authority. So does the trust." He sighed. "They're valid." Douglas stared at the table, but Walter was already showing memory problems. "The recording dates don't support that argument," the county attorney replied calmly. "The transfers were completed while he retained legal capacity." She closed the file. The workshop, the land, the trust account, all belonged to Ethan Brooks. The room became very quiet. Outside, someone started a pickup truck. Life continued beyond the courthouse walls. Inside, years of uncertainty ended with a few sentences. Douglas remained seated. His shoulders seemed smaller now. "I spent months trying to find another answer," he admitted quietly. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought there had to be something left for me." Ethan looked at him without anger. "Why?" Douglas rubbed both hands together. "My construction company folded after the recession. I refinanced the house twice. My wife got sick. The insurance covered some of it. Not enough. I kept telling myself I'd catch up. I never did." He gave a tired laugh without humor. "When I learned Walter owned 40 acres, I convinced myself he'd forgotten to update the paperwork." His attorney spoke softly. "I advised Mr. Brooks to verify the documents. I didn't know these existed." Douglas nodded toward the military box. "Neither did I." Silence returned. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been waiting since the first day. "Were you the one watching the workshop?" Douglas looked genuinely confused. "What?" "The camera. The man in the woods. The break-in." Douglas's forehead tightened. "I hired a surveyor to photograph the property from the county road. That's all. I never stepped onto your land. And I certainly didn't shoot your dog." His surprise felt real. The county attorney looked between them. "Shoot your dog?" Ethan realized something important. Douglas wanted the property, but whoever had broken into the workshop wanted something else. Someone else was still out there. Someone who knew about Walter's secrets. Someone who had never entered this room. Douglas slowly stood. "I owe you an apology." Ethan said nothing. "I let desperation convince me that your grandfather had forgotten you." He clearly didn't. He reached into his briefcase and removed a folded survey map. "I paid for this before I understood the situation." He slid it across the table. "It belongs to the property. I won't be needing it." Ethan accepted it. Nothing more. No handshake. No dramatic speech. Sometimes the biggest battles ended quietly. Outside the courthouse, Martha waited beside the truck. Well? Ethan looked toward the mountains in the distance. We're going home. Atlas wagged his tail once before climbing into the passenger seat. As Ethan opened the truck door, his hand brushed the envelope inside his jacket. Walter's final letter. The legal battle was over. There was nothing left standing between him and his grandfather's last words. For the first time since finding the rusted bus, Ethan knew he was finally ready to hear them. The drive back through the mountains felt different. The road hadn't changed. The pines still stood where they always had. The creek still followed the valley floor like a silver ribbon beneath the afternoon sun. Only Ethan had changed. Atlas rested with his head against the truck door, sleeping more deeply than he had since they arrived. The fresh bandage around his shoulder peeked through his thick fur. Every now and then one ear twitched, reacting to sounds outside even while he slept. Old soldiers. Old habits. The cabin came into view just before sunset. Martha quietly excused herself after making coffee. I think Walter wanted this part to be just the two of you. She closed the cabin door behind her. Silence settled over the valley. Ethan placed the unopened envelope on Walter's old workbench. Its edges had yellowed with time. The handwriting remained steady. Strong. Written before memory had begun slipping away. Atlas walked over and sat beside the bench. He didn't lie down. He simply watched, almost as though he understood this moment belonged to all three of them. Ethan slid one finger beneath the flap. The paper opened without resistance. Inside rested a folded letter. Nothing else, no money, no legal document, only words. He unfolded it carefully. Walter's familiar handwriting filled every line. Ethan, if you're reading this, then you made it home. That matters more to me than anything written below. I've spent most of my life fixing things that belonged to other people. Tractors, generators, roofs, fences. Some jobs paid well, most didn't. But every repair taught me the same lesson. If you build something with care, it'll outlive you. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Walter. He kept reading. I wanted to build one thing that belonged to our family, not because land makes a man rich, because every soldier deserves one place in the world where he never has to ask permission to come home. Ethan lowered the letter for a moment. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines. He remembered returning from Afghanistan. 3 duffel bags, 1 divorce, 1 apartment emptied while he was overseas. No place had ever truly felt like home after that. He looked back at the page. Walter had somehow understood, without Ethan ever saying a word. The next paragraph stopped him. You may wonder why I kept writing the name Atlas. The answer isn't about prophecy. It's about gratitude. Ethan frowned. He continued. Long before you were born, I served in Vietnam. Near the end of my second tour, our patrol walked into an ambush. I never saw the tripwire. The dog did. His handler never had time to call him back. That German shepherd pulled me off the trail before the explosion. The blast took him. It spared me. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Walter had almost never spoken about Vietnam. He'd mentioned rain, mosquitoes, heat, never combat, never loss. Walter's handwriting continued. His name was Atlas. I promised myself that if I ever lived long enough to have a family, I'd never forget the life that dog gave me. Good dogs don't just protect people. Sometimes they protect generations. Ethan slowly turned toward the German shepherd lying quietly beside him. Atlas looked back with patient brown eyes. He hadn't known. Neither of them had. Walter hadn't predicted the dog's name. Life had simply completed a circle neither man could have imagined. Ethan continued reading. If your dog carries that same name, don't waste time trying to explain coincidence. Some gifts don't need explaining. Accept them. He laughed softly through wet eyes. Still teaching me. Atlas walked over and rested his head beneath Ethan's hand. The veteran scratched behind his ears. You've been carrying more than either of us knew. The final page waited. Walter's handwriting grew slightly larger. Not weaker, more deliberate. One last thing. The workshop isn't yours because I built it. It's yours because I hope you'll keep building after I'm gone. There are veterans who came home carrying things no one else can see. There are ranchers who work until their hands fail. There are widows whose heaters stop working in January. Charge the ones who can pay. Help the ones who can't. Don't count the money. Count the people who leave standing a little straighter than they arrived. If you do that, you'll finish the mission I started. Love, Grandpa. The last line blurred, not because the ink had faded, because Ethan could no longer keep his eyes dry. He folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. Outside, evening settled across the valley. The workshop stood framed against the mountains. The cabin glowed with warm lantern light. Atlas walked onto the porch and looked toward the forest. The same forest where someone had watched them. The same valley where fear had followed Ethan every night since he arrived. Tonight, for the first time, the memories of war no longer felt louder than the sound of the creek. They had not disappeared. Perhaps they never would. But now they shared the valley with something stronger. Purpose. Ethan stepped onto the porch beside Atlas. Together they looked across the unfinished workshop. Tomorrow, there would still be walls to finish, windows to hang, doors to square, lives to rebuild, including his own. The first snowfall came early that year. A light dusting settled across the roof Walter had framed and Ethan had finished, softening the sharp edges of the workshop and laying a quiet blanket over the valley. Smoke curled from the chimney just after sunrise, carrying the scent of oak and fresh coffee into the cold mountain air. Atlas was already outside. The scar beneath his thick coat had healed into a narrow silver line across his shoulder. He still favored the leg on bitter mornings, but anyone watching him cross the yard would never mistake him for a broken dog. He made the same rounds every dawn. The porch, the workshop, the creek, the tree line. Only after satisfying himself that everything was as it should be did he return to sit beside the front steps. Waiting. It had become his post. Inside the workshop, Ethan unlocked the wide wooden doors. The hand-painted sign above them was simple. Brooks Veterans Workshop, no logo, no slogan. Just the family name Walter had carried with quiet dignity his entire life. Frank was the first to arrive. As always, he carried 2 boxes of spark plugs and a grin. You know, he said, looking around the finished building, Walter would have complained that you painted over perfectly good wood. Ethan laughed. He would have complained either way. True. Sam Reeves pulled in behind him with a trailer full of used tools donated by families from neighboring towns. Carl Hansen followed an hour later with shelves he'd built from reclaimed cedar. No one had asked them to come. They simply did. Word had spread through the county that a veteran was fixing equipment again in the old valley. The first customer arrived before lunch. An elderly rancher stepped carefully from his pickup beside a rusted generator. It quit on me yesterday. Ethan knelt beside the machine. The carburetor was clogged. The fuel line cracked from age. Nothing complicated. He cleaned the jets, replaced the hose, and had the engine running before the old man finished his coffee. How much do I owe you? Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. If you can afford it, leave whatever you think is fair. And if I can't, Ethan smiled. Then next time your neighbor needs help, You stop and give it." The old rancher looked at him for a long moment. "You sound just like Walter." "I hope so." As winter settled over the mountains, the workshop became something Ethan had never expected. Not just a repair shop, a gathering place. Veterans began finding their way there. Some came because someone at the VFW mentioned the place. Others arrived after hearing about it from a church bulletin or a hardware store conversation. No one asked uncomfortable questions. No one demanded explanations. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they talked until midnight over coffee and the old wood stove. One man rebuilt chainsaws. Another repaired antique radios. A former Army medic organized the shelves. A retired Navy mechanic taught teenagers how to rebuild small engines. Hands stayed busy. Minds slowly followed. The nightmares never disappeared completely. Some nights, Ethan still woke before dawn, heart racing. On those mornings, Atlas would already be waiting beside the bed. The dog never barked, never panicked. He simply rested against Ethan until breathing replaced memory. Little by little, the bad nights grew farther apart. Early one spring afternoon, Carol Mercer arrived towing something behind her truck. The faded yellow school bus, fresh tires, new wheel bearings. The same blue stripe still ran along its side. She climbed down, smiling. "Told you I'd settle my debt. You didn't have to tow it all the way here." "I know." She looked toward the workshop. "Walter belongs home." Together they parked the bus beside the building overlooking the creek. Ethan climbed aboard alone. The familiar scent of old vinyl and motor oil still lingered inside. Nothing had changed. He ran one hand across the steering wheel, the workbench, the cabinets, the faded map covered in colored pins. He left everything exactly where Walter had left it. Visitors often asked why he never converted the bus into another workshop. He always gave the same answer. Some places aren't meant to be changed. They're meant to be remembered. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, Ethan carried Walter's journal into the bus one last time. He placed it carefully inside the cabinet beside the driver's seat. Next to it rested the folded letter, the property deed, the trust papers, and the old brass key. Not hidden anymore. Preserved. Atlas jumped onto the first step and looked inside before settling near the entrance. Guarding, as he always had. Ethan stepped back into the cool evening air. The valley glowed beneath the last light of sunset. The workshop stood solid against the mountains. The bus rested beside it like an old friend finally allowed to stop traveling. The creek kept flowing, exactly as Walter had promised. Ethan slipped both hands into his jacket pockets and looked across the land his grandfather had built for him long before he knew he would need it. He finally understood. Walter hadn't left him a bus. He hadn't left him 40 acres. He hadn't even left him a workshop. He had left him a way back. Back to purpose. Back to people. Back to himself. Atlas walked over and leaned gently against his leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Come on, partner. We've got work tomorrow." Together they disappeared into the warm light spilling from the workshop door, while behind them the old yellow bus stood quietly beneath the pines, no longer a forgotten relic, but the first chapter of a life that had finally found its way home. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty can change a life, or leave a 0 if you believe it's never too late to start over. No long message is needed. Just one number lets us know you were here. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, second chances, loyal dogs, and ordinary people finding extraordinary hope, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another unforgettable journey waiting for you in the very next story. Until then, thank you for watching. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.